Now, to start this afternoon session, we're actually going to change the format slightly now. Session 4 is a little bit different to what we've seen this morning. We now have a fireside chat between Mikal Bøe and Dr. Martin Stopford. I think it's safe to say that neither of these gentlemen need a long introduction from me, but to condense it down about as far as I reasonably can. After a 30-odd year career in the shipping and energy markets, Mikal is the founder and CEO of Core Power since 2018. And Martin's long career has encompassed ship finance, shipbuilding, and leading the research arm at the world's largest shipbroker, on the way to becoming probably the global authority and trusted voice on maritime trade and economics. So it should be a very interesting session. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mikal and Martin.
As Toby said, we're trying a different format, and there's always some nervousness around doing things like that. But we're not afraid of doing new things. You're not afraid of doing new things, and I think we've proven that in Core Power we're not either. But Martin, Toby said you don't need an introduction, but to be fair, you're one of the most recognizable faces and voices in this industry, and somehow you've survived 50 years in shipping and ocean transportation through being a shipbuilder, being a banker, being an economist, first and foremost, and I believe also a farmer at some stage. So you have a unique perspective, and I know that you're writing the next edition of your sort of definition, your defining book on maritime economics, the one that most of us who studied that subject have read. I wanted to ask you to start off this conversation. You know, as we see this pendulum of global geopolitics swinging in a certain direction right now, how does the shipping sector fare in that, and what does that do as an element in the discussion that we've had here today around, you know, transportation and economics and decarbonization?
Well, thanks very much, Mikal. I'm a bit embarrassed by the introduction, but I'll buy it. I've spent the morning lurking at the background, in the back there, sort of watching what was going on, and it's been a fascinating discussion. I sort of came away feeling a bit like it's a bit like a Taylor Swift concert. You know, everybody here is a fan, and although I think you're Taylor Swift, right? and so I think, you know, you mentioned several times my 50 years, which takes me back to the early 70s, 1971. And I guess one of the things you notice over time is that you do spend a long time worrying about the wrong things. I mean, it seems to come up again and again. And so as I listen to, you know, there's not much that hasn't been put on the table this morning by the panels, and very well and very eloquently. But the question really is, what should we be worrying about, and how is this sort of thing really going to play out? And I mean, Michael Parker mentioned in his introductory comments that you know, this was even bigger than this. The last big change was containerization. This is even bigger than containerization. And I mean, that sort of took me back a little bit to right when I started in 1971, when containerization didn't exist. It was very far from, there were container companies who were relatively small. There was many thousands of traditional companies, or many hundreds, if not thousands, of traditional liner companies, all running very specialist ships around the world. They'd recently been the main source of global transport. They were well-known names, terrific quality. You know, their word was their bond, sort of thing. And actually, a big American consultancy did a study in 1971 for the UK government on shipbuilding, and they forgot to mention containerization. They didn't mention it at all. Of course, they got pilloried for it, but nevertheless, it tells you how subjective that was at the time, because when you took all these liner companies and you, sorry, this is turning into, I'll carry on, okay? You take all these liner companies and you want to move them forwards. And of course, there are so many different ways they could go. Mr. Moller was reported to be keen on pallets. There was the Scandinavians put together big ro-ro consortiums to do the ro-ro trade. And you had things like lash being developed. And this was at a time when nobody really was very clear how you'd solve the problem of fitting all the diverse cargo that you put into multi-purpose liners into these containers that only they hardly carried anything. And it took, going back to Michael's point, I reckon it started in 1956. That was Maclean's first effort. First voyage, early 60s, first transatlantic voyage, 1966, and then you start to get one or two container companies. By 1971, it was just on the radar, perhaps, and I would say it was probably 2000 before containerization actually, hit the big time and became a part of the industry. And it was probably last year, as far as I can see, is the first time the container business, or 2022-23 was the first time the container business probably earned more money than bulk and tankers. It was they suddenly came right onto the agenda. So that that's a long answer to a short question, but the answer is that we're looking at, if Michael's right, and what we're looking at is even more difficult, then we need to figure out what we should be worrying about. And one thing to worry about is the globalization, and possibly the fact that is changing. Well, not possibly, that is changing very substantially. What used to be, bulk shipping globalized the world. And the latest trend is to see us moving back towards perhaps regional world economies. This is what Bradell used the phrase, regional economies. And so we start from a position where you can't just assume that you're going to have 40,000 TEU container ships shuttling between Asia and Atlantic. That might not be there. We need the cargo in the interest. I somehow got off on a very long answer here, Mikal.
But the implication of that's profound, right? So if you have regional, I assume that's not necessarily just going to be Atlantic Pacific type of divisions. You're going to have different blocks of interests in here, but it has, as far as I can see, two really profound implications, and specifically to what we're talking about here today. And one of them is shipbuilding, right? If all shipbuilding is concentrated in one area, and you start to see that break between demand and supply side of that, you're going to have to start to see shipbuilding grow back in areas where it's traditionally been poor. And I think of that as something that needs a new product, right? And that's potentially where floating nuclear and new nuclear ships could come in. So it's that creation of jobs and technologies, whatever, in new areas, potentially with partners then in other areas where it comes. And the other one, of course, is in cargo transits in those areas. If you're short sea or relatively short sea, like transatlantic, speed becomes a completely different thing, doesn't it?
Well, this is true. But going back to the shipbuilding, I'm sure China plans to do it all themselves. Before they built their cruise liner, I went to visit the chap who was the production manager, and we pointed out how much money you can lose on these things, and he said, yeah, sure. So, I think that backing up from the Asia issue, all the growth is in Asia, and there's the shipbuilding question and whether the shipyards are big enough and sophisticated enough to work with the equipment industry to pull together a ship that is capable of properly supporting a nuclear power plant. And that's something perhaps we ought to come back to. But the other issue is that if Asia is by far the fastest growing area, that's where all the whoopee is, and the countries that are Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia. Indonesia's got 17,000 islands. I looked it up yesterday on the internet. And these countries don't have good internal communications. It's tailor-made for short sea shipping. And I would argue that one of the best possible applications for nuclear, as we've discussed before, is small nuclear power plants in port towns supporting short sea shipping services. Which
battery then? Is that battery powered?
Battery. I've seen studies. There was an MIT study recently that said you could do up to 3,000 miles with batteries with today's technology. Apparently, it's 200 tons of them. That's what they said. It was a lot.
MIT should be building ships.
Well,
getting into ship owning.
It just emphasised the point. You only be careful what you worry about, because ships are not the big. All ship owners fantasize about ships. But and the question of whose wife is going to get named after, probably that's sexist now, isn't it? So I can't say that.
But Martin, how does decarbonisation play into this then? Because all of a sudden now you've created a much more complex area, a much more complex landscape, and we still have that. And I described this earlier as a sort of one side of the equation, which is decarbonisation. The other side of the equation is that we must be able to carry on in this business in a sustainable economic way. We need to be competitive, right? How do we remain competitive and decarbonize at the same time in a world that starts to divide up like this? Does it become technology competition, sort of China versus Russia versus the OECD?
Oh, where does one start on this? I mean, funnily enough, I think one issue is whether the companies that we have today are the right companies to build an industry about this. It's a long time away, but then it takes 10 or 15 years to build a company. And the companies there's about 26,000 shipping companies today. About 11,000 of those have only one ship. These are bona fide companies. These are companies with genuinely owning and operating the ships. If you take out the 11,000, you end up with about 5 ships per company. And the rule of thumb that I was told is 2 people on shore for every ship at sea. And this is a product of this bulk shipping. We've been through 50 years where everything was done through the market. The market is absolutely wonderful at squeezing, taking one cycle with another. It squeezes the return down to just enough to pay Michael Parker is 8% or whatever it is, and to have perhaps 1% over. Sorry, Michael, I'm being. So the first thing you might look at is the company structure and whether that can be developed. And that was mentioned several times, the educational side and the building of organizations with the knowledge, which I think IMO, I really like the way IMO is going forwards with the EEXI, CII. I mean, that's in a way drawing in the digital framework so that, ship owners, you can't spend money in shipping without having a good lever, and that is a lever. The charterers won't pay for it, they just want the cheapest freight. So I think the companies and the regulatory framework is one part, and then we come to the fact that on the, if you like, your competitors, the industry's between a rock and a hard place. They would no doubt like a ready-made unit, but a nuclear power unit, but realistically, well, how far is that? I mean, to get up to a decent critical mass, or when would we need to be building all of these ships? When do we start building them?
It's an incredibly interesting question because it predicates that you have some end game in mind, right? And if the end game is that we're going to meet the Paris targets or the IMO targets for 2050, I mean, clearly a massive industrial scale construction program is going to have to happen. I mean, we're building Rome all over again. And I think the industry generally is getting around to this idea that that's unlikely, whichever way we go. And the question is, okay, is that the important thing? Or is the important thing that we're making strides towards something that, as I alluded to earlier on, Martin, this idea that we don't just solve the decarbonization challenge, because we could simply do that by stopping everything. We could just stop doing everything we do and it would go away, right? But that's not going to happen. So we got to solve the other side of it, which is how do we keep going? How do we keep developing? How do we keep making things better? How do we keep energy efficiency how do we keep that going forward? That's the big thing. That enables both decarbonization and economic prosperity. And how quickly can you do that depends on how quickly you can get the first demonstration machines out. And rather than that demonstration machine being a sort of one of a kind, come and have a look at it, like the Savannah back in the 1950s, a sort of wonder of technology that it becomes a museum piece. You've got to go straight for that. You've got to go straight for that order book. You've got to go straight for that multiple orders so that you can get the first generation out in numbers, because that brings the cost down substantially. And you get a really interesting split then between the cost of the technology and the cost of the energy.
Well, it's interesting you say that, but I'd say this morning, there was two hares running, one of which is, I totally sympathise with what you're saying. You've got to get enough critical mass to get somebody into blah, blah, blah. The other was do it now. There was quite a few calls for let's do it today, this morning. And on the argument behind that is, let's face it, you learn by your mistakes. Start building something, You build a ship with a big hole in it and say, here's the dimensions, give us something to put in it, And that way, isn't it better, rather than sort of jollying people, having Taylor Swift conferences for the next 10 years, isn't it better to actually get something going?
Well, if we, like Taylor Swift, can make $1 billion on our conference business, I think we'll just have a separate division that does that. And
well, you could too, but the biggest container company made, or not the biggest, but they made $33 billion in 2023, 2022.
Fantastic.
The money's around. The money is there.
Getting to your point, though, we don't need to demonstrate nuclear in ships because it's been done over 700 times before. And bear with me a second. We did this in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we continue to do it in our navies for a long time. So it's sort of taking that naval reactor technology and proving that it works at sea is a bit like proving that we can put a car together and make it roll up and down a hill. What we've got to do is we've got to take the reason why we don't have nuclear ships today, which is because you cannot insure them commercially in ports. And if you can't have commercial insurance in ports, you can't go into a port. And if you can't go into a port, then, what's the point? So we've got to solve for that. And in order to solve for that, we need that new technology to be developed and to be built and to put that on. And we can't put that on prematurely because we've got to get to a point where it's validated, it's licensed, we're allowed to do it. Remember, it's a fairly tightly regulated market, this. And then we start to demonstrate. And what I'm professing is rather than creating another demonstration program, let's create a commercial program. That's kind of what we're doing today. And that's why we're you said these Taylor Swift conferences like we have today, I'm flattered by the comparison. It's about building demand. It's about logical explanations of why this is important and all of the things that are difficult about it, and building that demand in the market so that that order book can be formed before 2030. And that order book in itself is going to be an incredibly important part of how you then set up the manufacturing and the financing of that manufacturing to get this built. I don't see any reason why by the time we get to 2050, nuclear in maritime hasn't reduced, if you like, the emissions from this sector by anything between 25 and 50%.
Well, let me just come back to this question then of the timing, because one of the problems, that we analysts always like to run off the age profile of the fleet. And if you do that today, you've got an enormous bulge in replacement investment in starting about 2031, 32. It didn't happen last time, but it might happen this time. And so, in a sense, and there's there's a fighting chance you might end up riding up there on a super cycle, because nobody's ordering any ships. So, the order book's still very, very low. And so supposing you get a run of years where freight rates are very high and deliveries remain quite low because of the difficulties of deciding, and I mean on my list here, there's 7 different ways you can deal with. The industry's between a rock and a hard place. You know, you don't know what to order because, and equally the regulators don't quite know what they're going to be regulating for. And therefore, the question really, you've got, well, we're just going down the list, you've got the green fuels, which are an expensive alternate option, and they might or might not be there. We heard that discussed very clearly this morning, but they're definitely not a very good solution. We've got batteries, which I think have lots of potential and are very interesting in an era which might be more interested on maybe local trade, perhaps fed by your super ships. We've got the carbon capture, which there's quite a few different things coming around on that at the moment, and would fit in very nicely with methanol synthesis with a little nuclear reactor as well to get rid of the carbon. I guess the question that's in my mind is it absolutely impossible that the nuclear ships might be in there hustling end of this decade, early, just getting a prototype? And if you did that, wouldn't that light a fire under the regulators to get you, and the insurers, to get you the conditions that you need? Because if you leave it to debate, we all know how long it takes to get a global regulation in place, you know, and I shall certainly be dead before that would happen. So.
You're absolutely right. All we do is talk about it and suggest it, as was done back in 2010 and previously, etc. Nothing ever really happens. And you end up with this endless inertia that doesn't have any forward momentum in standards, rules, regulations, investment, manufacturing, you know, creating the ecosystem around the workforce and supports and all that kind of thing. So yes, absolutely. So the key thing is you got to do something. You can't just talk about it. So what we're doing is we're, together with our partners at TerraPower, Hyundai and Southern Company, we're building that first test reactor. That's going to become that commercial scale reactor that we can deploy in this market. And that is going to go into a commercial demonstration program, commercial prototyping program that then becomes, you know, a larger program. It's all about how you can scale that manufacturing to start with. I mean, to make one is difficult, to make two is less difficult, to make three, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you get down from that prototyping cost into the nth of a kind sort of cost. The key thing, though, is to demonstrate what it can do that doesn't just join the ranks of everything else that we've got. This is a disruptive way of looking at not just energy, but looking at the way that we deliver energy and which customers we deliver it to. Floating nuclear has that potential to be a way of delivering a small modular power plant, not a small modular reactor, small modular power plant, directly to industrial customers in certain areas of the world. That's something that they can't do today. The other one is for nuclear ships. With nuclear ships, you really have to rethink the business model around them. I mean, you're not going to be buying fuel for them. You're not going to be operating them as in the same way that you do today. You're not going to have the same people operating. They may be on different trades. They may play a completely different or an evolved part of the value chain between shippers and receivers. And in that commodity chain, in that industrial components chain that ships fit in as a sort of faithful slave of the economy, you have that potential to do so much more and disrupt the way those things work. I mean, you've got a different cost profile to start with.
Well, on the cost profile, I think if you could get some numbers on the table, because nobody, I mean, I've run the spreadsheets myself based on the numbers that you gave me, which are, you know, they might be right or they might be wrong, but it would be nice to have something a bit mature. I mean, I think people, even if it's look, Michael, if it's a 20-year timescale to get a nuclear ship to sea, realistically, to build a company capable and an onboard team capable of running a ship like that, you would want to be thinking about it at least 10 years ahead, probably much more. And so the company development needs to run alongside the ship, which needs to run alongside the regulators so that you do actually streamline the whole process.
I think that's what we're seeing today. I mean, this is the third year that we're running a summit for this market, and there are twice as many people here today as were there last year, and that was twice as many people the year before. So I think that hunger for knowledge, that hunger for understanding what it is that we need to do to develop that corporation, to develop that, if you like, the chain of the supply chain and the academies and the knowledge base and the economic models, etc., that sits behind this, is there to be done. And I think that's coming. I think that's the next step here, Martin. I don't think it would be sensible for us to blurt out some numbers with any more confidence than you tell me what's going to happen in 2050.
Well, you've only got to watch our politicians.
Right, well, there you go.
You know.
So I think that's the next step. And I think, taking from what you've said today, it's interesting, we're looking at the geopolitical pendulum swinging. And it's swinging towards a not deglobalization, but a breakup of the global trade order, which changes the way shipping works, which changes the way we think about decarbonization, because we're able to we're starting to imagine running more short sea type operations, which require different sizes of ships at different speeds, and you could potentially do that with different technologies for different reasons. But also it changes the way we manufacture and the way that we move things around. So, shipbuilding, for example, coming back into the Atlantic is an interesting idea. I know you ran a shipyard in the Atlantic, and you know how hard that is. But the future is a wonderful place, and I think this is the sort of things that potentially takes us there without pontificating exactly how it's going to happen. It has that, and I think that's what you're setting out for us.
Yes, I think to sort of go back to my first comment about you always worry about the wrong thing. I think worrying too much about the technology is the weakness, because it has to work commercially and socially, of course. But those are the sort of three legs of this stool.
Wonderful.
The technology, the commerce, and the social interface, and they all have to be there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for the insights and for being here with us today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.